cities surrounded by armies. Desolation. People fleeing for fear. Days of vengeance. Great distress on the land. Wrath to the people. People falling by the edge of the sword. Being led away captive. Holy city being trampled underfoot. Signs in the sun and moon. Perplexity, dismay, men fainting, powers of the heavens shaking. In the middle of that, the Lord says, this is your redemption. Imagine what judgment would be like. That's pretty serious stuff. The Lord says it's redemption. But I think what the Lord is doing, this is all a response to what the disciples were talking to him about at the beginning of the chapter, when they were showing him around Jerusalem and showing him around the temple and saying, oh, look how beautiful this is, and look how marvelous this is. And it was basically the renovation that Herod had done to the temple. It wasn't anything that the Lord had prescribed to David or Solomon, as David was planning the temple that Solomon built. None of those things which he had even told Moses centuries before. Herod just kind of did it the way he wanted to. And the disciples were very proud of it, very pleased with it. And it had just been finished for a short time by that time. And they were bragging about this building, and Jesus was basically saying, you got your trust in the wrong thing. You got your trust in the building. You got your trust in the schemes of man, because that Herod's temple was just his way of winning the hearts of the Jewish people. And in the end, it didn't really work. Because as Jesus said, it ended up with Rome ended up destroying Jerusalem. And Jesus was just saying, when you put your heart in the plans of man, put your heart in the ways of man, it's not going to work out the way you want. He said, all these things that you think are so beautiful, they'll be gone. They'll be decimated. They'll be destroyed. Because your salvation is not in any of those things. None of those things were ever prescribed by God. They didn't follow God's plan when they rebuilt the temple. And so Jesus was saying, you think everything's going to be fine with this? Put it in a nutshell, he's saying, your salvation is not in your circumstances. And don't think that through good circumstances you're going to find redemption, and you're going to find peace, and you're going to find joy, you're going to find salvation. Circumstances don't bring any of those things to man's life. But it was actually through all those things that the Lord brought salvation, not just to Jerusalem or just to Israel, not just to Judea, but through those things, that's a part of God's plan, bringing salvation to the entire world. It was God dismantling the old covenant so that the new covenant could come into play. The covenant for all mankind, the covenant for the whole world. The covenant where instead of being built upon being a child of Abraham, was built on being a redeemed child of Jesus Christ, our Savior. As Hebrews calls it, a better covenant, based on better promises. Before that could be enacted, the old system had to be torn away. The old system had to be brought to nothing. And that's what Jesus is talking about. And I think we can see this at work today in our own nation and numerous nations of the earth. There's a lot of unrest, a lot of turmoil, a lot of lack of peace. And like it says here, men's hearts are failing them for fear. And could it be that in the midst of these times, in the midst of these days, again the Lord brings forth the pattern. Lift up your heads, rejoice, your redemption's drawing near. All the prayers that have been prayed for centuries, many decades, Lord, do something in our nation. Break this, this hold that the powers of darkness have over our nation? Could it be that this dismantling of the existing order is God answering our prayers in our nation and other nations of the earth? Could this dismantling be God saying, you prayed for it, now stand still and see my glory? Look up, your redemption's drawing nigh. Because sometimes the Lord answers our prayers in glory. Sometimes He answers our prayers in comfort. He answers our prayers in things that we are so happy with. Sometimes He answers our prayers in things like the gospel reading says. But in the midst of it all, the Lord is answering the prayers. The Lord is answering even the prayers of David, where in the last verse of Psalm 25, which we read, the last couple of verses, he said, Lord, guard my soul and deliver me. Don't let me be ashamed. And then he says, I wait for you. Redeem Israel, O God, out of all his troubles. Who would have thought when those things that Jesus talked about here began to happen in 70 AD? Who would have thought that the Lord was redeeming Israel out of all his troubles? But He was. That was part of God's plan. And as Jesus was sharing with the disciples, don't pin your hopes on circumstances, and don't pin your hopes on the fancy things that man can come up with. Because that's not always the way God works. Sometimes He works in what we would think is devastation. Like this line says in the song that we sung about a decade ago. The world is shaking. Not shaking with the devil's attacks, not shaking with man falling apart, but the world is shaking with the love of God. And I really believe that's what we're experiencing in these days. The world is shaking with the love of God. In the midst of the shaking, we can say with Jesus, lift up your heads. The redemption is drawing nigh. Stand.